Hello everyone, welcome to this video. Today I'm very pleased to welcome onto this video conference 5 of our board members of the Compliance Institute Southern Africa. They are Doronso, Stefan, Marcelina, Suzette and Tasneem. We will speak about what is the impact of the COVID-19 situation been on the compliance officers, the compliance discipline. And I thought that would be a good idea with our board members being senior compliance officers themselves in various industries to ask them some questions. So let's kick off with this. Thanks guys for joining. I would like to know, first of all, what was the biggest impact that you've seen from a compliance perspective of this whole COVID-19 situation?
Yes, Riani, I think what we need to acknowledge is that these are uncertain and complex times for businesses, for customers, and also for compliance officers. At the heart of this crisis is to ensure that we actually identify what is mission critical and what are the activities that can be deferred or deprioritized. The implementation of crisis management has resulted in assurance activities, including compliance activities, that are moved out, specifically if those compliance activities had been focused on some of the essential services that are being performed. And maybe as an example, I can indicate any compliance activities relating on claims, for example, in our organization has definitely been moved out. I think what's important is the focus at all times should be on ensuring that our organizations have actually identified what the relevant risks are, what are most likely, what are potentially worst case scenarios, and that there are adequate and well-tested contingency plans to mitigate those risks. At this point in time, there is a focus on advisory work to ensure that the business remains compliant, to ensure that controls and processes are effective. And we can see the value of including compliance in our crisis management meetings, including compliance in our senior and executive, at a senior and executive level, where these decisions are being made. In short, we have seen in this crisis what the role of compliance is and how the role of compliance officers have actually changed over time, and therefore it's important that as compliance officers we continue to upskill ourselves, specifically if we look at launching digital solutions, and sometimes these are actually at quite short notice, so that our companies remain operational and we can serve the needs of our customers. What we've also seen is a high degree of reliance on compliance officers to communicate specifically or to review specifically some of the communications that are due to be issued.
So, Suzette, very interesting that the assurance activities get pushed out, and obviously one understands this in the context of the emergency. How far out is it pushed? I mean, this is probably an unfair question, but how important is it then? Is assurance then really?
Yes, I think it goes back to the question about identifying what is mission critical, specifically with those essential type of activities. So what we've seen is that some of the assurance activities are moved out by a quarter at this point in time, or that there's an agreement that post-lockdown, these assurance activities would then be reassessed to make sure that they don't fall off the plans, but that they continue, but in a sustainable manner to ensure business continuity at this point in time.
Thanks. I think just here, linking onto that whole discussion, have any of you started, or was it necessary to do any of this these monitoring activities remotely? Is it even possible to go remotely at this point with compliance activities?
Yes, Riani, the organization that I work for has actually been quite successful in the transition to remote working. But it's taken a huge effort from IT in particular, to arrange the necessary logistical requirements, being able to access the servers and the systems remotely in a secure manner. So given that reliance, it is actually quite tricky to be able to do so. But once everything is in place, then it should be business as usual. I would imagine that for smaller organizations, it may be a bit more of a challenge. And particularly, I was thinking about the independent compliance practitioners who particularly may face a challenge in this regard. You know, they rely on, in a lot of instances, from my past, for my past sins, I was an independent practitioner, and you actually rely on going to visit your clients' offices and being able to do on-site visits. So in the absence of that, one would have to assess, like Suzette said, where the risk areas are and what monitoring needs to be done, and then find an alternative method to go about doing it, perhaps liaising with the business and having questionnaires and that kind of thing may be used as an alternative in the interim.
Okay, thank you. I think the other thing that sort of really caught my attention during this time was the absolute amount of fake news. And it's not just fake news about drink this tea and you'll be saved. It's fake news in terms of, here's the new regulation. You're going to be arrested if you are 5 people in the car, and that kind of thing. And I think the complexity that came in with this whole situation was that the regulators had to act very quickly, and kudos to them, which they did. I'm really impressed with our regulators, I must say that. But having to react so quickly with regulations that even before it is gazetted, it is already effective. And the situation that we saw on national TV where ministers were contradicting each other. So how, as a compliance, I know as a compliance institute, we certainly had to really up our ante in terms of making sure we don't distribute fake news and fake regulations. But how did you handle that to make sure that by the time you send out communication and whatever, that it's actually the real deal? Marcelina, that you want to say something? Yeah, just unmute. Just hang on.
Okay, got you.
There you go.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we handled it in Namibia from a compliance perspective. And because my business is a private equity investment business, we have some critical challenges that we are facing because we have, for example, 6 portfolio companies underneath us in different sectors, which is to comply with different regulations that are in line with the lockdown regulations that the government has set. Our lockdown was supposed to end now, tomorrow, on the 16th, but it has been extended to May 4th. Now, what it does is, one of our businesses in agriculture, which is a primary sector for food. The other one is in transportation, which is also a primary sector for transporting necessary goods and so forth. So we had to look at different functions. Now, with the lockdown happening, with the farm, the farm that is a hydroponic farm that we run, we have, for example, 160 women that are working there. Now, we just finished a greenhouse, and these women are dependent on the food, but we have to now also comply with regulations in terms of social distancing, making sure that the employees are kept safe with masks and gloves and so forth, which has been a trying exercise. And from a business perspective now, you have 2 options. The government wants you to stay open because you are a primary sector. Now, staying open now, you have to look at how many employees can you allow at any given time to be on the premises, on the farm, to be able to work and still maintain the social distancing. So the regulations have been very vague in many respects in terms of particular sectors. So what our Minister of Justice has been trying to do is to have weekly commentary on the national television, where she's trying to explain regulations based on realities that are happening on the ground. That has made it very easy for us to also try and comply with the regulations without are failing because as a regulated, every industry is regulated. Now, our role as a private equity fund manager is to ensure that whatever we invest in also complies with different laws in that sector. And that is absolutely a trying time for us, really.
Okay, so it seems to me like So it seems to me regulator followed a strategy of regular communication as widely as possible, as publicly as possible, to make sure that people are staying on the same page and that fake regulations, fake news doesn't take a foothold.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Any other ideas from South African perspective, perhaps?
Yes, Riani. I think if we look at what the World Health Organization communicated, they said that we are not just fighting an epidemic, we are also fighting an infodemic. And what infodemic refers to is an overabundance of information, and some of this information may be accurate and some of them not. And that really makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they actually need it. As an example, in March, an average of 46,000 new posts on Twitter was actually linked to inaccurate or misleading information about the crisis. So what's important is that we need to leverage off the tools that are available to identify misinformation. Use reliable sources such as the World Health Organization, the SA coronavirus webpage. So in short, for me, it's about checking the source, checking the author, checking the content, and also from a South African point of view, what is very welcomed is the fact that the government has indicated that it is actually a criminal offence to spread disinformation about the disease. And we've also seen that action has been taken about those individuals who have spread the disinformation. And I think that is something that should be welcomed.
That's a very strong response from the regulator. Did you also notice when fake news is distributed, it seems to be some of the things that are indicators to me are poor grammar, spelling errors, and then these radical claims, like these things like people will get arrested and thrown into jail if they do this or that. It's so radical that you look at it and you go like, really, are there people that's going to read this and believe it? So those are also indicators that I use. Right. Any other comments on that point? Okay. Then,
just from a business perspective. From a business perspective, in our organization, we have a regulatory change team, and they send out communication on a daily basis of everything that needs to be known by the organization. So we have one true source of information that impacts on the business and also on us as employees and people.
So it gets back to Marcelina's point, that regular communication, trusted source is absolutely key in times like these. Okay.
Absolutely.
So then I think, thank you. So I think just moving on to the next point, or my next question is, I've heard some comments in the business that were saying things like, times are now so critical and so chaotic, compliance officers must jump in and help. So does that potentially impact on our independence as compliance officers? Could it potentially give rise to conflict of interest, perhaps?
Riani, I think it would depend on which capacity the compliance officer assists. For example, some of the BCP forums may wish to include the compliance officer as part of the process that they follow. You may be called upon with regard to the dissemination of information internally and externally within the organization. And in my view, those certainly will not affect the independence of the compliance officer nor create a conflict of interest. So I think one would just have to be mindful of the type of role or the capacity in which one is called upon to provide assistance to the business. If you're called upon to assist in looking at the numbers and trying to make the numbers work, well, certainly there would be a conflict of interest. So I think the barometer would be whether or not you feel comfortable to provide the assistance that is required.
Thanks, Tasneem. Marcelino?
My question would be, can you hear me?
Yes, Karen.
My counter question will be, what is meant by jump in and help, and with what, from a compliance perspective? Then I can answer the question better. The reason I'm asking that is that I wear two hats. I'm a compliance officer by nature of my profession, but I'm also a business person. And at times like these, you have an ethical dilemma that you are facing. Do I save my business regardless of what I comply, or do I sit back and comply with regulations that will inevitably have an impact, financial impact on my business? So that's why it's critical for me to understand what you mean by, as compliance officer, somebody is to jump in. Because I have a compliance function on my board level of my business, but I'm also a business person. And the first part is to save my business financially.
You seem to have lost Riani there.
I think from my side, when I heard Riani's question, where the compliance officer would be required to jump in, it would be in my situation where this would add great value by us getting into business discussions, because in a health organization, some of the decisions that need to be made very quickly, and we can't be still waiting for compliance to make a decision later. So at the very concept of the initiative or concept stage, you are called in. And this is where business compliance officers, group compliance officers, SME compliance functions are called into a business meeting so the decision can be made right now, right here, and not have to go through later stages. And in an advisory capacity, I don't really think that we can get into a conflict of interest. We just need to know what it is that we're advising and advise according to our mandates.
Yes, I think also linked to that is the question about what our level of preparedness is for events such as this. And I know Stefan, being the only male on the call, has been dying to say something. So I don't know if you can maybe talk about what do you think about the level of organizations to be prepared for these black swan type of events. Stefan.
Yeah, thanks, Suzette. To be honest, I don't think that any organization could have been prepared for this type of black swan. In my view, this is probably the black swan of all black swans, and it'll probably be the black swan of our lifetimes. It's certainly the black swan that's had the biggest impact on society globally since the Great Depression, I would imagine, since 1929. And I don't see another similar event like this in our lifetimes. In saying that, I think that there were some organizations that were better prepared than others. I had a discussion with Tasneem about this earlier, and I think that there were organizations that were much better placed because of their BCPs being stress tested, and that they were, as a consequence, they were in a position to get their staff out of the office and functioning fully within a couple of days. So ultimately, I think nobody could have really prepared us for the extent of this. But I think what it highlighted to me is the importance of making sure that your BCP is live, that it is relevant, and that you're able to adjust it and stress test it in instances like this.
Yeah, what was interesting for me is, as part of that testing, there was actually an external company that came in and they literally locked the senior management team in a room, and then they threw these scenarios at you. So you arrive at the office and you get a letter, for example, and this is what the letter says. How will you respond? And then throughout the day, it was for, I think, the better part of a morning. They threw different scenarios at you. So how would you respond under this? And then they actually gave you the factual dependencies and limitations that the company had. So following that, you had to then do a full assessment. What do we need to change for us to have been better able to cope with the scenarios that we were faced with? And then, I mean, there is obviously a cost involved. And again, you know, I have said this earlier, is that I think larger organizations are obviously better placed to be able to put these things into place, like having a disaster recovery site, an alternate site that you can send your staff to work in, because you would have to pay. I mean, our organization has to pay the rent for that place, has to have the equipment ready, you know, and all of that. But failing that, I think smaller organizations can also have other measures. And I think that will be one of the learnings out of COVID-19, to help us to be prepared for these kind of shock events, or black swans, if you will, going forward.
I think what this highlights, is that, you know, the words BCP, or business continuity and disaster management, actually mean something. You know, we tend to think of these events as things that will never happen. You know, when we draft a disaster recovery plan, we don't think that the whole world would potentially come to a standstill. So, you know, disaster actually means disaster.
Yes, I think we've, thank you for that, Stefan and Tasneem. We have Riani back, so I'm just going to hand over to her.
Thank you. I'm a little bit in that. It seems like I'm very dark now. I'm not sure why I'm not getting proper light on my face, but never mind. So I think that, you know, they speak about these the black swan, and I hear your point, Stefan, that, you know, nobody could have really foreseen it. However, if you also look at the videos of the TED Talks that the likes of Bill Gates was involved in, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2019 also predicted this as one of the key risks. So it's interesting to me that we sort of knew about it, but we didn't know about it. I think it's one of those things that it's almost so unthinkable that you think, you know what, the likelihood is so low that it's really going to happen to that extent. And yet it happened so quickly and so fast. I think the speed of it was just the thing that shocked me the most.
I think the reality, Riani, is that, you know, since the Spanish flu in 1918, this has been on, you know, the world sort of radar, you know, the next big pandemic. And we've had instances like MERS and SARS and others, and Ebola, but it's also always been sort of regional. So nobody really, even though there were warning signs by Bill Gates, Obama, and, you know, the World Economic Forum, I don't think anybody really thought that this would be happening again, you know, but it would be this global, this fast, and this impactful.
Exactly. Right.
Okay, Leila,
yes,
Riani, just to add a little bit to it.
Yes, sure.
I completely agree from a country perspective that this was something that we saw coming in December, but we all kind of thought it will just stay in China, and it will not become overnight a global pandemic. For example, when we did before we did our first lockdown, we had a case where we were trying to bring Namibians from the European countries, students that are studying there, that were quarantined back to Namibia. And our ministry, now imagine if a private organization, like Stefan says, has got disaster recovery policies, beautiful ones, but you never thought that you would actually have to start using it. Imagine a ministry, a department of the government, where things are just chaotic generally. Now, the ministry is within a week, as soon as the president announced, and I was at the forefront of it, the minister announced the president announced state of emergency, they decide they are bringing 200 students back from the US. We are a 2.5 million population. The ministry is ill prepared to deal with having 200 people that is to come back to Namibia and first be quarantined for 14 days before they can enter the system. So it was a complete disaster from arriving at the airport, for them to identify centers where they can put them, preparing those centers for people to be quarantined properly, it was completely chaotic. So I can only imagine if private sector is ill prepared for a disaster such as this from a perspective of being prepared ever, because having something on paper and actually having tested it and it can work in a disaster like this are two different things. Now imagine the government. So I always try to applaud the government to say that, you know what, with the resources that the government has and the timing it takes the government engine to move to implement things, we have to applaud the government the best, especially the ministries of finance and ministries of health in our respective countries, that they were able to move in a way that has contained the virus on the soil of Africa to a large extent. You understand what I mean? Because we don't have the first world resources, except South Africa. Most of the other African countries don't have the first world resources to move on a pace that it is, let alone a small business like mine. I was not prepared for it, but I have the beautiful policies in place for how to act in a disaster. But since we have never tested it, I mean, most of us don't even test fire drillings on a regular basis for buildings. We just kind of exist with it. Now imagine having to now clean the hands all the time. So that's all I wanted to say. We need to applaud the government for taking compliance at least the best possible the way that they could, while preparing to save the societies in Africa.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think just the takeaway for me from what you're all saying is that it's one thing to have it all on paper. It's quite another thing to actually test it on an ongoing basis and not wait for when disaster strikes to then test it for the first time in reality. I think just to end the whole conversation of today, in hindsight, you know, that's such a beautiful place to be in hindsight. What are the things that the sort of, and I think if I can ask each one of you just 1 or 2 points per person, what are the sort of things that you think, if you had known, and if we had said, you know, at the time when that World Economic Forum Global Risk Report came out, and Bill Gates was saying, guys, this is coming, and Obama was saying this 5 years ago, if we had said this could just be broader than regional, it's actually going to be global, what are the things that you would have done differently in your organizations from a compliance perspective, perhaps?
I think this has brought to me the need to fast track digitization of the compliance processes and the compliance functions. And we also need to have gotten more creative and utilize the other monitoring methodologies, monitoring activities that we have, and not just focus on sample, focus on inspection, but have some remote ones. And there are quite a few which will be found in the GACP as well, that we can use, and not just focus on the more traditional ones. And somebody said to me earlier that never let a good crisis go to waste. Take some lessons away.
Absolutely.
I think to add to that, Riani, you know, a lot of these technologies, RegTech, they've been in existence for a long time. I think compliance functions have generally been slow to adopt these technologies. I think the one good thing that comes out of this crisis potentially is that, you know, business as a whole, but also compliance functions will start to be forced to adopt these types of technologies. And it also, as Doronsa says, you know, it presents us with an opportunity to really apply our minds as to how we can go about things differently. And I think there's a lot of good technology that, if applied properly by a compliance function, it can add a lot of value to the monitoring function.
Thank you.
Yeah, Riani, I think also to follow on from what Stefan says is around the business itself preparing for digital. I mean, globally, it's been found that businesses that were ready for and had already started embracing digital working have coped better under this crisis. So simple things like traditionally you would accept a signed mandate or application form from your client. So under the current lockdown circumstances, you cannot get a client signature. So, being able to have robust processes in place to be able to facilitate clients still going about doing their regular basis, people needing money and not being able to sign. These are all things that if you have got the digital capability, it is easier and much safer to go about securing that, those kinds of initiatives. But if you haven't even begun to apply your mind to it as a business, it suddenly becomes, oh, what do we do now? So I think it's about digitization for the business and also for compliance, because then our monitoring then, like Deransha says, needs to be able to likewise align and use digital technology to monitor. To check that the necessary checks and balances were in place, where there's an e-signature that has now been accepted, for example. So I think it goes hand in hand, the compliance function and the business being able to align and to use technology more effectively and efficiently.
Thanks, Tasneem. Marcelina?
Say it on two levels. Last year, South Africa and us in Southern Africa, whose banking systems are linked, were plagued by phishing, where people's funds were being lost because of people, breaching your communication systems, your banking systems, your emails, and so forth. A lot of companies lost money, and the insurance companies in South Africa repudiated so many claims against digital theft of people's money. Now, that should have already set off some red lights for most of us that are in the financial services sector already, in terms of testing our digital platforms, our electronic platforms, how we are doing businesses. And I think on hindsight, for a business like ours or in the financial sector, if we have taken what was happening last year in terms of how people were being robbed through using electronic platforms, if we have started using systems that test the risk of digital systems, test the risk of whether your documents that you are uploading in the cloud is safe and all of that, then most of us will not be panicking now. Because now, in hindsight, we are trying to now use the systems like Teams, trying to use the documentation on servers, trying to use electronic signatures to be able to move our money and so forth. But all of us are kind of also jittery because of what happened last year in South Africa with us that are linked to South African businesses. So we are thinking, is my personal information safe if I put it in iCloud? Is my information safe if I give it the electronic signature for money to be found? So this coronavirus is actually, or the COVID-19 is actually teaching us to say that we need to take digital platforms seriously, more seriously, ensure that as financial providers and financial industry, that we are constantly testing it against risks and vulnerabilities that faces us, and not wait for crises to come. And then we do things, go back to, and as compliance officers to start stepping up to be more involved in digital testing, checking the protocols of digital business doing, all of those, so that the businesses that they are supposed to be advising is more more protected. You can never be 100% protected, but you can make sure that the disasters like this. I remember that when I was a regulator, I used to tell government companies all the time, test your risk, test your system, test this. But now that I'm on the business end of it, I don't do it myself. So I'm preaching to the preacher, but I've never done it. So it shocks you. It really wakes you up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marcelina. Suzette, any parting thoughts from your side?
Yes, I think, they always say hindsight is 20/20 vision, but I think ultimately when we look at where we currently are, there's risk and there's reward. And on the risk side, I think Tasneem has spoken about crisis management training and the ability for us to facilitate those types of discussions and make sure the training happens, to look at how agile our risk management and our crisis management plans are and our BCPs, make sure that there are clearly articulated roles and responsibilities to make sure that everybody knows exactly what is expected of them. But that's on the risk side. On the reward side or on the opportunity side, we have spoken about the definite opportunities, digitization, automation, looking at how we are deploying our capital in our businesses, looking at what the opportunities are. And I think there are definite acquisition opportunities in the current scenarios. But the clear winners are definitely your fintech and your insurtech capabilities. And it's important for us as compliance to make sure that we continue to upskill ourselves, to make sure that when we look at these capabilities and these opportunities, that we can do the necessary work to ensure that those are implemented in a compliant and in a sustainable way. And I think lastly, what I wanted to say is this crisis also gives the opportunity for compliance officers to clearly articulate and demonstrate the value that they add, the agility that they have to be able to respond to this crisis. And that for me is a clear opportunity for us.
Thank you very much. So listening to all of you, Daronsa, you said your piece, right? I'm just checking.
I've said my piece, Riani.
Okay, thank you. So listening to all of you and just sort of wrapping up on today's session, it sounds to me like we need a further session on this, and that session will be about how do we as compliance officers, what are the new skills that we have to have, what are the new trainings, what are the new curricula, so those kind of discussions we need to have as a discipline to make sure that we remain relevant. But for today, I think very insightful discussion. Thank you so much for all of your contributions and taking the time. And to all of you that's watching this video, drop us an email with your thoughts and some suggestions on further topics that you would like us to cover in these videos, or even if you wanted to participate. Let me know on my compliance address. It's Riani, it's RIANNE @compliancesa.com. Until next time, keep well, keep safe, and thank you all for joining.
Bye.
Ciao.